11 children. And I've said that, I'm 54 years old now, and I've said that so many times in my life as a way to let people know something important about me. My father left my family when I was 12 years old. And my brothers and sisters and I survived mainly because we had a very strong mother who often worked 2 jobs. And in the photograph up on the screen, you can see my 10 siblings. And that was before I was born. Do you think they wanted another one? No, they absolutely did not. And that's me at the bottom that I've sort of just placed there. And the tenement is where we lived the first 4 years of my life. Most of my older siblings lived there for a lot longer than me. And given that I am the youngest, I got to see my older brothers and sisters figure some things out for themselves and choose many different paths for their lives. And early on, I seemed to begin the process of understanding something. I didn't have the words for it until I became an adult. But as a child, I sought silence. I sought places where I could be alone, where I found quiet, solitude, for play, for imagination. Sometimes places where I drew or read. And I grew up Catholic, so of course I prayed. And this little kid, this little me, intuitively knew for me to survive, I needed this. And now the older me, the me now, thinks about this and realizes and wonders, how did I know that? William Wordsworth referred to these early childhood imprints as spots of time. Certain indelible scenes implanted in his childhood that persisted until he was ready for them. And I believe that that's something that is true for all of us, and something that became very true for me as a young artist. Because the imprints of these moments, the spaces that I found for this solitude that I'm talking about, became important, and it impacted the work I did as a young artist, as a young art student. And while in graduate school, I devoted a whole entire year to a series of paintings that were memories of spaces from my childhood. The details, the feelings of those spaces I sought as a child became the subject of my work. And so on the screen, on the left is a photograph from the attic space in the house that my family eventually moved to. And then on the right is a painting from a memory of the cellar space. And of course that might seem strange, that a child would seek those spaces to find solitude and quiet. But those were the only spaces I could find. In the large family where there was chaos and often so much going on. And you'd think that with all those people around, that there was, people taking care of the children, but not always. I learned early on how to take care of myself, so I knew I needed those spaces. And they made an imprint on me and became a visual resource, memory for future work. I know now that this was possible because I was fully present while in those spaces as a child. I was looking, I was feeling, I was hearing. I was fully there, sitting, being. Of course, now I realize that it helped me to survive. But it also taught me something about presence. Because in those moments I learned the practice of presence, of being somewhere, fully being there. And it helped me begin the journey to being an artist. So I began to study art in college. And as a college student, I found other things. I found yoga and meditation, walks in nature, sitting by windows. I found that those things facilitated this practice, this desire to just be, to be present, to be in the now. Books on meditation, studies, teachers came in and out of my life. And the one thing I started to notice early on in my young life as an art student was this practice of presence was essential to me in the way that I wanted to make art. I wanted to make work that was real and true. I wanted to make work that was mine. So I started to ask myself, how do I do that? And what does that mean? Because when you're an art student, you learn very early on that there's so many ways to be an artist. And there's so many different approaches to making art. And eventually, you find your way. You find the medium that you love, the materials that works best. And so, of course, for me in college, I started to also say and ask, what is the work I want to make and how do I want to make it? And initially you think, many young art students think, well, I'll make a perfect picture. And then I'll make another perfect picture. And then another one. And those will get framed. And I'll be successful. But that's not how it works. You realize that it's not that simple. And I was fortunate to have very good teachers. And especially if you want to grow as an artist, I learned, and make mature work, I realized that I needed to move beyond that perfect picture. And I realized it's not about making pretty pictures. And so what I learned as an advanced studio art student, what I liked is to begin with moments of inspiration. Again, back to those moments of being present out in the world, noticing things, seeing. Like Allen Ginsberg says, notice what you notice. So I started to notice what I noticed. And so those things that I saw, those things that made me feel, those experiences that I felt and remembered, I would start there. And then allowing the practice of making, the process of making being a part of the piece. And this meant the result could not be planned. I would have to step into this way of creating, knowing that I might be spending hours and days on something that may not work out. Maybe the material would win, it would get away from me, maybe it would all end up on the floor. And it often did, and it continues to at times. And usually the ones that end up on the floor often are ones that I just lost my way and stopped paying attention. Because the presence that was required in the studio became my goal. One mark to another mark to another mark, each moment changing the whole. And I learned that was what I loved. Was to be present in that moment, recognizing each mark and the impact that it had on what I was working on. course, I'm not alone with this. There's a very big tradition, painters and artists who love this way of working. And one of them is Philip Guston, who was part of the New York school, 40s, 50s, 60s, an American painter. And I found this quote by Guston about this practice of being in the studio in that moment. And he said, the demands in this dialogue with myself, I give to it. I make some marks, it speaks to me, I speak to it. We have terrible arguments going on all night, weeks and weeks. Do I really believe that? I make a mark, a few strokes, I argue with myself. Not do I like it or not, but is it true or not? Is that what I mean? Is that what I want? And he continues, he says, but there comes a point where something catches on the canvas, something grips on the canvas. I don't know what it is. You can put your paint on a surface. Most of the time it looks like paint. And who the hell wants paint on the surface? But there comes a time you take it off, you put it on, it goes over here, it goes over there. As you get closer, you start moving in inches, not feet, half inches. There comes a point when the paint doesn't feel like paint. I don't know why, something grips the canvas. You have been sucked into the whole thing, like a rhythm, and this thing starts acquiring a life of its own. And you feel as if you've made a thing, a living thing. And so those are the moments that I live for in the studio. And here are a couple of pictures of my studio at different times, just the door. And those moments of being there in the studio with the work, making the work. And of course, it can seem so obvious saying something like, yes, you need to be fully present. But we know that that's hard. And it's not just during the act of making, it's the act of seeing and the act of being. To be there for inspiration, for the thing, the moment that will bring me back to the studio and will make me want to make work again. And how that happens, and how can that happen without the practice of presence? I don't know. And so during this moment that we're all been experiencing with COVID, this pandemic, the space of the studio became a place for me, a refuge, my inspiration. And so I did a series, just being in that space, being fully there, allowing myself that opportunity to just be. And it took many forms, and I was there at different times of the day, just allowing myself to just be, to just see, to just respond. But sometimes, inspiration or being present, allowing moments to speak to you, because you're just sort of there and you're present and you're looking and you're experiencing, can be just the shelves in the ceramic studio, like the photograph on the right that inspired the piece that's on the left. And sometimes it's just how the window looks, that I sit and look and stare and I absorb that moment. And the window on the right is a photograph, and led to a series of pieces that are inspired by that moment. And in the making of the piece on the left, I didn't know what it was going to eventually end up like. I started with that moment where I was present, looking out the window, being inspired, bringing that to the surface, starting there, and then having that that experience, that give and take with the material, and allowing myself to respond to a mark, and then another mark, and then another mark. And I'm not sure how well you can see this triptych. But you know, sometimes for me, inspiration and seeing things that are lit by some beautiful light, or the landscape on the way to school, or something that stays with me, that inspires me. Sometimes it's actually harder. And one of the hardest times in my life was when my mom died a few years ago. And I wanted to make work, but I didn't know how. You know. So I just showed up. I said, okay, I'll just go to my studio. I'll be there, I'll be present. And what I did was I put up a piece of paper and just started making marks. And mark to mark to mark to mark. And every time I made a mark, I'm thinking about my mother. And I had no desire to think about a finished piece, or where this was going, or what it was going to look like. I was just giving myself permission to be there, to be present. And it led to 3 pieces in honor of my mother. And I named them, you know, the series, All the Things I Wish I Had Said. So sometimes my work becomes abstract. Sometimes the inspiration is obvious, like when I go out west to New Mexico and experience the high desert in Abiquiu at Ghost Ranch. But even when I went there this past June, I got there and got clouded by some thoughts and some anxiety related to just expectations. Was I going to be able to make good work? What was I going to do? I had all this beauty around me, but I was like scared to fail. So I remembered what I did after my mom passed. And so what I started to do was I started to make a series of pieces, giving myself permission to just be present, to grab a handful of pastels, and to begin to make marks. And so that's what I did. So and that helped me let go of the stuff in my brain telling me that you need to be doing this, you need to be doing that, what if you don't do good work? Gave me permission to just be there. And so the practice of that led to me doing these kind of meditation drawings each day during the month of June. And that led me to also do these kind of watercolor sketches of the mesa that was right outside my studio while at Ghost Ranch. Again, recognizing that sometimes inspiration is literally just right there. You know, finding that, sitting there, being with it. And this helped me through that process of letting go of the expectation of this sort of pressure I had put on myself to try to maybe make some great work. It helped me to come back, be present, be there, and make things that I really actually needed to make. And these are just some examples of those things that came later during that moment of time that I was out in New Mexico. But mostly, I'm in the studio because I love the process of making stuff. And I know that I wouldn't be here if I hadn't had that, or this journey from that younger me to now. Sort of seeking quiet, seeking solitude, seeking inspiration, and recognizing it so that I can make work. One of the writers that I read, Richard Rohr, talks about presence, and he refers to something that he refers to as pure presence in his little book, Just This. And he says, whenever your heart space, your mind space, and your body space are all present and accounted for at the same time, you can experience pure presence. A moment of deep inner connection with the pure, gratuitous being of anything and everything. It will often be experienced as a quiet leap of joy